So we are recording now, and welcome from YouTube to a Wednesday night workshop on effective note-taking strategies. And here is the pitch I want to make at the beginning. I think when people think of note-taking strategies, they often are thinking of like note-taking systems. Phelan, have you had to do anything like this in like a high school class, a college class, where they literally make you kind of do a note-taking system?
Yes, in a high school history class, we have to take notes probably a couple of times a week to actually get turned in. And she would give us a template for our notes depending on what the chapter was.
History's a good one for it. I remember literally with the ruler going in, it had to be like an inch and you get graded on an inch. Here's my big pitch. People, when they think of effective note-taking, I think picture something like this, like these note-taking systems. And I am going to make the argument that these note-taking systems are not important, or at least they are not that important. What is way more important than like if you have the Roman numerals in the right place are really these two things. And this is what we're going to talk about. How can you use the notes you're taking to actually learn the material? I know that when I was my first semester in college, I had a history class. I took really great notes. And then at like the end of the class, I would close my notebook, put it in my bookcase, and pull it out for the next class. And by the time a test came around, I had this great record of all the stuff that had been talked about in class. But it was like, what good did it do? And so that's this first thing that we're going to talk about. How can I be not just having this really great record of all the interesting things the course instructor talked about, but how can I turn my notes into study tools so I'm actively learning throughout the semester? And then the second thing we're going to talk about is just how to make notes that make sense, and especially notes that make sense later. We're going to start here because once you know how to turn the notes into study tools, all of the reasons for doing this just make a little more sense. And so I'm going to start right here. First study tool, a way to turn notes into something that you can actually learn from. And this is the real one quick two of how this note-taking system works. I indent a little bit over here. I take notes just like you normally would. And then somewhere inside 24 hours, I write a quick summary, maybe a few words over here. So I just indent, take notes, make a summary. This is why it works. This is the reason for it. As soon as I get out of class, as soon as I close the book that I was just taking notes on, as soon as I even like minimize the video, because you totally could take notes on a YouTube video that you find really helpful, as soon as one of those things ends, this invisible stopwatch goes off. And studies have shown that that stopwatch has about 24 hours on it. And as soon as that 24 hours is up, anything that I've forgotten is gone and is like irretrievably gone to the point that I have to relearn it all over again. So the whole point of this summary is inside that 24 hours. I'm trying to beat that forgetting clock. And the way I do it is I write a really quick summary somewhere inside that 24 hours after class ends, after I close the book, after I minimize the video. This is going to be a weird example. But if you have ever kept a dream journal, you know that this works. If you keep a dream journal, just write a couple quick sentence summaries. Here's the dream that I had. Here's what happened. It is the weirdest thing. Days later, weeks later, for me, it's like years later, you can still access and remember what happened in that dream. And that's really what we're doing over here. So instead of all this information starting to evaporate as soon as class is over, as soon as I close the book, by going back to it in that 24 hours, writing a quick summary, it's like I'm not onto the material so that it's going to stick and less of it is going to fall off. The second reason for setting up notes in something that looks like this is it really naturally turns my notes into flashcards. So I could, after I have this summary over here, cover up the right-hand side and go like, okay, recall, what does that mean? What is underneath my hand, just like I would with a flashcard? I now have this study tool where I can do that moment of active recall, where just like as if I were meeting someone that I know their name, but I cannot remember their name, that feeling of actively trying to build a connection in the brain, I can self-quiz myself on these same notes. If that totally doesn't make sense to you, putting this little summary in the left-hand margin, that is okay. You can also totally put those summaries at the very end, at the block of the page. You could even have a kind of outline of your notes and write almost an outline of what a chapter in a textbook was saying. The thing that I'm really pushing here, though, is that summarizing and doing an active self-quiz, active recall, without those two things, that quick summary, that active recall, like using flashcards, Um, Studies have shown if we don't do those two things, we tend to forget about 50% of the material in days and then up to 80% of the material in weeks. And so if you think about how many times you're in class and how many hours you're spending reading, as much as possible, we want it to not evaporate. And here's those two study tools that we just know the science shows they work. The other thing I'm going to show you here, so if I set up my notes like this, I can really kind of naturally later turn them right into flashcards. I have a summary over here, and I have the details over here. And so now if it were me, I would the day in class in 24 hours, write the summary, do some of that self-quizzing. So I'm starting to not forget it and move it into my short-term memory. And then maybe later in the week, restructure those things into flashcards. What I want you to see here, though, by just taking notes in this really kind of simple, straightforward way, I've set myself up so I'm already almost building a study tool, and I have this study tool later on. So these are more of those two strategies. That first one, again, is recall. Really, it's summarizing. So I'm boiling down what happened into a short note so that I do not forget it, or I forget as little as possible. And then reciting, so I'm just like I would with the flashcard, actively trying to remember what is on the other side of these notes. And here's a bunch more strategies for both those things. Here is strategy number 3. Here's my pitch for it. I can tell you I took about 4 years of German in high school, and then another 4 years of German in college, and I today cannot speak a lick of German to you. I can tell you the reason I think that I cannot speak a lick of German to you now is because I never did this. I never really applied the information. What this study strategy is about is moving beyond just memorization, which those other two things are good at, and moving into applying information in new ways. And that's the way that it really sticks. And so this, in a sense, is trying to take the information that I'm trying to memorize and connect it to like these other trees of thought that already exist in the brain. Here's 2 different ways to do it. That first one in fancy teacher jargon is called elaborative interrogation. What that really means is kind of like they do in detective movies where they put bright lights on a suspect and ask it some tough questions. I'm taking the information I'm trying to learn and putting some tough questions to it. I want to make that a little more like concrete. So Dalen, I'm going to totally put you on the spot. I'm like pretty sure that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. I feel like I heard that in like a Schoolhouse Rock song 10 years ago. Is that true? Or like, do you feel like it's true? This sounds true. Mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell. What do you think?
Yes, it was always the definition we were given.
Okay, so we're on this. We believe mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell, but I honestly, I don't really know what that means. Maybe it was on my notes even at some point. Mitochondria equals powerhouse of the cell. So I could take that and put it through this study strategy where I ask it some tough questions like, okay, why? Mitochondria, why are you the powerhouse of the cell? How did you become the powerhouse of the cell? If you're the powerhouse of the cell, mitochondria, what does that make the other parts and pieces of the cell? I could also do something that's sometimes called in fancy teacher jargon, asking metacognitive questions. So those are questions to get me to think about my own thinking, and what that might sound like is something like this. Why am I learning this? Like, why is the course instructor including this in the syllabus and in the PowerPoint slides? They're making a choice for this information to be here. So why do I think the course instructor is including this in this course? Or, okay, I just learned this. Is there any way that I might use or apply this information in my life, in my other studies? Or I just learned this piece of information, but in order to understand this, what stuff did I have to know beforehand? Or even, I just learned this piece of information. What stuff might I learn next afterwards now that I've learned how this piece of information makes sense? What I'm really pushing here is that those notes that I'm taking in class, just as I turn them into something like a flashcard that I can self-quiz myself on, this is moving kind of in the other direction, turning my notes into things that I can start asking those questions, those metacognitive questions on, asking those application questions so that I'm pushing the material into some deeper waters. If you set up your notes, as we were looking at the beginning, really simply, where it's over here's the notes, over here's a quick summary, you also could just as easily turn your notes into something like a study guide, like per se this, Or over here is here's the big stuff I think I'm going to be tested on, the big stuff I'm studying, the big stuff I'm learning, maybe headings, chapter titles, the big bolded stuff on PowerPoints, or even those summaries that I made throughout a class of my own notes. This tool that you'll have is called Bloom's taxonomy. You do not have to remember that, but here's what it does. So as soon as I have those headings, I can do almost these kind of fill in the blank questions. Like, for example, let's say up here, mitochondria. What is a mitochondria? How would you classify a mitochondria? What would happen if a mitochondria was injured? Part of why I'm showing you this. So right now, if you take those notes in that two-column way we're looking, notes here, summaries here, you really naturally have a way to turn them into something that you can self-quiz yourself on. You have something that easily becomes flashcards and something that easily becomes these study guides. I'm also showing this to you because I know that a lot of typical study materials like flashcards, like Quizlet, they tend to stay over here. When in college, a lot of the tests start to move over here and even all the way over here where I'm applying and evaluating information in a real test. The other thing I can do with this strategy where I'm trying to take the information that I'm beginning to memorize and connect it to these other trees of thought in the brain is I could try teaching the topic to someone else. So this is maybe one of the most effective study tools out there. Every research that has ever been done, good study techniques, talks about this. And you could, if you wanted, find a real person that is willing to hear you out and try to teach out the thing that you just took notes on to them. You could even though do this like imaginarily. As you get out of class, imagine your friend Mark, who is not in your class, maybe not interested in the things you're interested in, but if you imagine Mark and you're like, okay, how can I explain this thing that I just learned about, that I was just taking notes from this lecture, that I was just taking notes from this textbook, how can I teach this to Mark in a way that would be interesting to him and make sense? What would he need to know that I've already learned before? I can tell you if you do these two things will happen. One, as you actively or imaginarily teach something out, you will come up with all of these great descriptions, examples, metaphors, all these ways of understanding a thing that are perfectly tailored to your brain. The second thing that'll happen is it's like you'll be teaching something and teaching something and teaching something, and then you can't because you don't know this thing as well as and you didn't know it yet. It is a great way, this teaching a topic to someone else, to naturally find the places where you got to go back to the books, go back to the notes. What I want you to see from these 1, 2, 3. So I started with a really pretty simple note-taking technique, summary, and notes over here. And now I can turn them into flashcards, study guide. I can create summaries and also questions inside the notes that I'm making. And again, you'll have all these tools. In just a quick moment, here's some more of those reflection strategies, questions that are really geared towards pushing an idea into some deeper and tougher waters. Here's the last study strategy that I'm going to talk about, and then we're going to talk about ways to make notes that kind of connect all this stuff. So this last study strategy, it is rewrite and reorganize, and my pitch for it is that it is always going to feel like I'm adding extra steps, but what I'm really doing is adding extra processing. So here's a couple ways to think of this rewriting, reorganizing. One is to how can you change the context of the information, recreate it in a new way? For example, taking a visual piece of information, like a diagram in a textbook, and turning it into language. So if you are taking notes in a textbook and you see a diagram, one of the best things you could do, because that diagram probably has a whole lot of information bundled in it, is to turn it into sentences. See, can I, in sentences, describe what this diagram is, what it means, what it's doing? By doing that, you will, I think, be surprised by how many things, how many light bulbs start going off, how many things you start figuring out, and turning that diagram into sentences. You can also go the other way, which is take the notes that you have and turn them into drawings. If you are a really terrible artist and can't draw for the life of you, great. Would highly recommend some goofy drawings, whether it's like this on a flashcard. Just by doing this, by adding this goofy drawing to my flashcard, I've done two things. I've turned information that was just language into something that's also visual, which means I've used more parts of my brain and processed a deeper connection to it. but I've also had this really deep hook. Like if you were in a test and there was a question about the illusion of competence, I bet those words, illusion of competence, they might stick with you. But this image, it would be seared in the back in your brain. Uh, you could also take those notes and just be like, how can I turn all of this one page of notes into some kind of concept, some kind of map, some kind of diagram that makes sense, maybe just to me. But anytime I'm doing that, turning something that's visual into written or written into visual, I'm totally reprocessing the material and making new connections to it. Last thing I'm going to talk about here is another way to change the context is to take something short and small and make it longer, or make something longer and turn it into something short and small. So, and we talked about doing a really quick summary inside that 24 hours. You could, and I have had lawyer friends that this is the thing that they swore by that got them through law school. You could, at the end of the week, take those different summaries and make a summary of the summaries. You could, then, as my lawyer friends did, make a summary of the summaries of the summaries, and on and on and on. Anytime that I'm taking that information and turning it from a page into a smaller, more condensed, more bullet pointed piece of information, I'm totally processing it. And you could just go exactly the other way and take one of those really small summaries on the left-hand side of the page and be like, okay, can I turn this into a full one-page, a 1 minute paper where I put a minute on the clock and see how much stuff can I write about just this one word, like let's say mitochondria. Those are all the study R's I want to talk about. And you can maybe see here is that they all kind of do something a little different. And just by setting up my notes in that way we looked at the beginning, I've really naturally built a system where right after class, I can do that summarizing. I can do that active recall, like looking at a flashcard using my notes. And I can maybe even do some reflection questions, whether it's literally putting them on the page, maybe in that left-hand column, or putting them at the end, or even just walking around the beautiful campus in the autumn sunlight and thinking to myself, how would I teach this concept to someone else? If you remember those three things, I'm going to write a summary. I'm going to quiz myself in the same day. And then at some point, I'm going to try to think how I would teach this to someone else. Those are three of the maybe most helpful, most impactful ways to use notes to learn and study in the week. I'm going to do a little of maybe all three of these things. Some of that active recall, like turning my notes into flashcards, some of those active reflection questions or teaching out loud or literally writing it down on a page, some rewriting, reorganize. I'm going to go back to previous materials from last week and the week before. If you've ever had a weekend where you're like, I know I should study, but I don't really know how to start, this is maybe a good kind of organization to something like that. Here's the last tool I'm going to throw at y'all, which is just this previewing. And so I have a pretty good study cycle using my notes at the beginning and turning them right into study tools. This is the last thing I'm going to add to the mix, previewing material. So what this could be is, let's say before a lecture, looking at the notes I have from the last lecture. Now, or looking at if the course instructor has given me access to the PowerPoints, looking through the PowerPoints. If I don't have access to that, even looking at the syllabus or the calendar, I'm in some way trying to get a sense of what stuff am I going to look at? Kind of like how if you ever have put directions into Google Maps, you look, right, of like where generally am I going to go? What highways am I going to get on? How long is this going to take? Instead of just press and go and like being like, all right, it's a surprise what the voice in my car stereo is going to tell me. I'm looking at kind of a map just to get a sense of what's going to happen. Like we talked about at the beginning, I'm activating prior knowledge, I'm activating schema. Every study that has ever been done on learning shows that this is an incredibly impactful thing. In some way, previewing the material, reactivating old connections, getting kind of a map of what's going to go on. It makes it way easier to learn material. So again, I'm getting way more out of the class and way more out of my notes. For course readings, that could literally be flipping through and looking what are the headings, the subheadings, the big bolded stuff, the diagrams. Just doing this again, I'm making a map of what I'm going to look at, like looking at Google Maps before I jump in. Some note-taking strategies for textbooks are even doing this more literally, where I look through and write, okay, here's the first heading, here's the subheading, here's the subheading, and making a literal reverse outline out of the chapter in the textbook before I even start, and then like filling in that reverse outline. That is a pretty good note-taking strategy. But the big takeaway, the thing I'm pushing to here is as much as I can reignite some of those connections before I start is going to make an impact on the learning and the note-taking. Here's what all that together kind of looks like. Before class, I'm just spending those minutes as things kind of settle down in some way, previewing my last week's notes, the syllabus, the PowerPoint if I had it. At the very end, I'm doing some of that quick summarizing, actively recalling, quizzing myself, maybe some reflection. Right before I start the reading, same thing, doing some of that previewing. At the end, some of that self-quizzing, some of that summarizing. By just adding these like 5 to 10 minutes, right here, here, and here at the beginnings and ends, like bookmarks, before, after class, before, after reading, I'm getting a whole lot more out of all the time I'm spending in class, all the time I'm spending. Those are the big study tools that I want to talk about, of turning the notes into actually study materials that I can really truly learn from. So the notes aren't this record of what happened, of the interesting things a course instructor said, but they are instead active things I can manipulate and learn from, like flashcards, like this study guide. I'm like, again, I don't mean to put you on the spot, Dalen. The stuff I just talked about, the summarizing, the quizzing, the acting, the reflection questions, are these things that like, because this is a fourth year at Aurora University, no? Any of those things that you've seen that just made an impact? Because I imagine you've done at least a couple. Any of those things that you've seen that just made an impact on getting material, learning out of class and like into that long-term memory?
Um, so I can struggle to take too many notes, or like when I'm highlighting, highlight like pretty much everything. So then nothing appears to be highlighted. So the idea of taking like a big paragraph and trying to make it smaller is really helpful. So you can kind of weed out the important information.
I think that's a great point because I know what you mean of the, especially if you're taking notes like in the book, is that what you, or like in
Yeah.
the, on the printout? Because that especially is, I have totally things from college from like last summer that are filled with those notes to myself. But if I just leave it like that, I have found at least I start to forget all these good ideas I had in the
Mhm.
margins and why I thought this was important. Versus if I take that one next step, I'm like, okay, inside 24 hours, I'm going to look back at the notes I took and turn them into something else, whether it's turn them into flashcards, turn them into like an outline, turn them into just one little summaries. Now I've reconnected my brain to it and I'm not going to forget this. I totally have books that have great ideas in them that don't make any sense to me.
Mhm.
It's gone. It's 2 years ago. So those are different ways to take the notes and actually turn them into active study tools and the different kinds of study tools that do the different stuff that they do. Let's look a little more at how to take notes that make sense now and make sense later so that they can become those study tools. What I want to do here is kind of like they do at the optometrist of which of these options is easier to understand visually, or easier to like understand the information. So right here, it's like paragraph. This is option one. This is option two. The reason I'm showing you this is because I know this is always a temptation to try to literally get down every word that the course instructor is saying and almost, get as like, I think it's easy to fall in this trap where it's like, I'm trying to get as much out of this lecture as possible. And so I start writing down every single word they're saying. What this note-taking strategy is, it is really just an outline strategy without the like numbers, letters, yada, yada. And how it works is that as the course instructor talks about something that seems like a bigger main idea, put it over here. When it seems like a subtopic or something connected to that main idea, I indent it a little. If it's more detailed explanation, I indent it more. I just go in and out on the page. The more big ideas go out here. The smaller, more detailed, more example like go further in, so that when I look at this later, I have like this visual map that's really easy to comprehend and turn into something like flashcards, into something like a study guide, but that also is saving me a ton of time because I'm not trying to get every word that the professor is saying. I'm not having to do things like as soon as possible after class, one should always remember to review. I'm able to move information a lot faster by just setting up that hierarchy that's going on. Here's my big pitch that the best note taking strategy in the moment is that I'm not trying to really learn the material. I'm just trying to make a map as best I can of what the course instructor is saying because I know that I'm going to look back at it later. I'm going to use the notes in all those active ways we talked about. So I don't have to be learning it in the moment. If I'm just making a really good map of the material, that's enough because then I'm going to turn it into summaries, self-quizzing, reflection questions later on. So I'm turning the information in the moment into a map and not having as much to worry about learning it in the moment. That said, here's the big stuff to really focus in that I'm trying to keep a map of when I'm taking notes. One is maybe pretty obvious, the key terms, facts, figures. What I want to talk about here, though, is if I kind of miss one of these, I can sometimes make it up if I have some of the others. So if a course instructor in a classroom says something like, in 1774, George Taylor Thomas III constructed it, and I'm getting lots of information. If I have at least a like George Thomas, 1974, something about a company, I can sometimes look back as I'm writing those summaries, as I'm looking through those notes at the end of the day, and add in those informations that I've lost it if I have a little bit of this. It is also, maybe you've done this, totally okay, in a notes to write questions to your future self. Like, professor talked about, blue color theory, question mark, question mark. And I'm again turning my notes into a conversation that I'm having with my future self because I know I'm going to be actively manipulating it later and I can start filling in stuff as I go. One of the other big things I want to talk about here, if I'm making a map of the information, is this, to especially pay attention anytime a course instructor says something like, for example. The reason for this is whenever a course instructor talks about an example, they're telling you really, this is a way that I think is a good example of how to understand this concept. And that probably is going to look something like what's going to be on the test. It might not look exactly, but it's probably something like what's going to be on the real test. And it's also essentially a course instructor, whenever they give you an example, they're walking you through, here's how I understand and think through this concept, what I think is most useful as a vantage to look at it through. Similarly, anytime a course instructor says any of these words, those transitions words like in addition, importantly, as well, they are giving you kind of clues of what to do with your notes. So like anytime a course instructor says something like another example, in addition, I would always pitch just to take a quick, like one, maybe two breaks, spaces in your notes and start a new thing. Because what they're telling you is they just started a new main topic. So what that might look like up here is even as soon as a course instructor is like, in addition, another main point is to start breaking down. There's a space in the page. If they say to elaborate, I could even do something like an arrow. Again, whatever makes the most sense to your brain. What I want you to see here is that I can really work the page to kind of show how information is connected. I can star for important stuff. And then I'm cueing into any time the course instructor starts directing me with signal words, with examples. I can even write really fast shorthand, EX, for example, and I'm cueing into these things that I want to for sure get down on the page. Last, I'm going to ask you this question too, Dalen. I'm asking you all to give me a thumbs up in the chat if you've had this experience where at the very beginning of a class, when like the coffee hasn't yet kicked in, you get a ton of information from the course instructor about last class, this class, what you're going to be looking at, why you're doing it. Give me a thumbs up if you've ever had. I'm seeing, yep. I know when I've taught in the classroom, I have done this. It's in part because your course instructor, as soon as they got out of that last class, they started thinking of all the stuff they wanted to include, all the stuff they feel like they forgot. And so at the very beginning, when the coffee hasn't yet kicked in, they often give you a ton of information, including sometimes, here's the most important things we're going to look at, or almost like here's a preview of why we're looking at what we're doing, which is like activating that prior knowledge. It's a great way to have that sort of Google Maps. What should I be actually taking notes on? Damon, I don't want to put you too much on the spot here. So this is like the big stuff that I always really pitch. Is there anything else that you feel like I'm missing, or is this stuff that you found useful taking notes as a student at AU? You can totally say pass if I'm putting too much on the spot.
Um, I can't think of anything else. Those are things that I all agree with and have kind of picked up on my own.
For sure. And this setting up a hierarchy, that's really what I'm talking about with using that outline indent feature working across the page. So I'm making connections, making the page work to show me how information is related to each other. Um, the whole reason for this, and part of the reason for like, you can even see it on this page, I'm trying to use the whole page to like show how information is connected, is to make it so I can get more information down on the page fast, which is often the name of the game. I'm going to highlight this number here. So the lecturer can speak anywhere from 125 to 140 words per minute. Uh, Note takers tend to be about 25. That's a huge difference. And so in some ways, whether I'm queuing into here's the most important things, the things I want to map out, I'm using the page to give a shape to the information, or even using shorthand. So I'm not writing every word down, I'm trying to boil it down into smaller chunks of information. Here's two examples. Here is Aurora University's mission statement. Aurora University is dedicated to the transformative power of learning. That's a lot of words to write down. If I heard that in a lecture, I could try to boil it down to something like AU equals dedicated to transformative power of learning. You can see though, when I start doing that, it becomes even more important that I revisit the notes, look at them again, write a summary, because that's something that might get murky and evaporate on me after a couple of days. But it takes this thing that would have taken a lot longer and puts it on the page faster, and it makes it so I'm already starting to process the material even as I'm just taking notes. This is one more step towards shorthand, where I'm shortening words literally. I'm taking out vowels, and so I got AU equal dedicate to transform power of learning. That's really fast to write. What I want you to know though, if you start doing something like this, shortening long words, taking out vowels, if it starts to trip you up or not make sense later, abandon it immediately. This is fine. This is a way to do it faster. This is how people would typically do shorthand, taking out letters, shortening words. But this is just being able to boil down into this sentence, into its most important parts. Will get you most of the way. This is so you have it just lots of pretty common shorthand, and you can see another really fast example. So if you picture how long this would take to write, the diameter of the Earth is 4 times greater than the diameter of the Moon, versus Earth equals 4 times x less than diameter of the Moon. Again, it's really fast, but it's something I'm going to have to look at. This is where I kind of let you all know that I've not been entirely honest with you. So I said at the beginning, note-taking systems, they don't matter. They don't matter so much. And that's mostly true. But we've kind of, as you can see, been talking about these note-taking systems the whole time. It's just instead of me being like, hey, you have to measure this 3 inches and then you do this and here's the process of what you do. You have to start with a 1 and then you go to an uppercase A and then a Roman numeral and then a lowercase and use blah, 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 blah. Instead of focusing on the system, you now can see, hey, if I just do something like this and indent my notes and write a summary, I have this way to immediately turn my notes into all of these other useful study tools. I even have this way, if I just do that indent without messing around with the more like elaborate parts of this note-taking system, if I just indent a little bit, I can over here write the summaries, I can write questions, I can write stuff that I learned later that like clarifies the stuff over here. I've just given myself this space that you can kind of see the why of it now to write commentary on my own notes. Likewise, this is less about getting the right order of like A and wait, do I go back to Roman numeral 1 or whatever? This is really more about just, can I use the page to naturally organize information? Again, whether it's in the lecture when stuff's going by really fast, or even turning something like a block of text in a textbook into something that's organized in this hierarchy where I'm starting to process the information and turn it into something that I can more easily pull into note cards, into study guide, into study questions. These last two I haven't talked as much about, and I want you to know 2 things about them. First is that they're both really, really bad if you try to do them to take notes in an actual lecture because there's too much going on and they would throw you off. What they both really are is I'm essentially taking this simple formula and giving it a little more structure. So here's where I would take the real notes, and then I'd add these extra things to it. You totally could use something like this, not for a lecture, but for like a textbook, where it's here's generally what happened, especially like in history, especially in a literature class, here's generally what happened, or the stuff I'm talking about. Here's what happened. Here's the who's, the characters. Here's the timing, yada, 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 yada. You could even take your notes from the history class, from literature class that you've done something like this with, and then reorganize them, again, recreating it. I'm using that great study tool into something like this that may really naturally show you, especially in the history class, oh shoot, I've forgotten to include these dates or these major characters, and now here's another thing I need to add. You could use something like this even as a kind of step-by-step flashcard. So it's event, I don't know, industrial revolution, what happened, and I can go slide by slide and self-quiz myself on a few different parts, and it's giving some structure to that. And similarly, this is especially good for if I am after I've made notes in a format like this, and I'm trying to figure out, okay, what stuff do I need to go back to? It again is having notes and then giving a structure to commentary on the notes. The KWL system, a lot of teachers use it. It goes, what do I already know about this topic? So here's everything I know. Maybe, for example, summaries from previous notes. What's all this stuff, the questions that I want to learn, the things that I'm trying to figure out yet. And then as I figure those things out, it goes right here. So again, you could, looking at a textbook, use something exactly like this, take last week's notes. What am I trying to figure out? What questions do I have? And then take the notes over here. Here again, you'll have them. Here's that KWL method. Here is that chart notes. It's especially good for history and also literature classes in the humanities. I talked a little about this really briefly, but this again is that strategy where I just, especially with a textbook, I take the headings, the subheadings, the sub-subheadings, the bulleted stuff, and I write them down on a piece of paper and then kind of fill in the blanks as I go and then create summaries as I go. This is maybe the most popular kind of note-taking system actually used by teachers called the Square or SQ3R. And what you can see now is it takes all this stuff that we talked about, all the study tools and note-taking strategies, and just puts them in one box. So survey, that's the preview. That's the pre-reading, looking like a Google map. Where am I going to go? Activating prior connections. What do I already know about this thing? And I just literally write it down. The questions, just like we did with the reflection questions, I literally write them down. And then sure enough, recite, review. You've already seen all of these things. If one of these, and you will have them all, note-taking more complex systems makes sense to you, awesome. Absolutely feel free to use them. They are both really good, but they are especially good after you already have maybe notes that look a little more like this as a way to restructure them. The big thing that I want you to have, though, are a system to take the notes that you're making and actually learn from them using those study strategies we talked about, actively making a summary, actively recalling reflection questions, imagining teaching to someone else, reorganizing, recreating, rewriting. And you have kind of at least a beginning of how to structure notes in a way that makes sense now and later and pretty easily turns into those different study strategies. I'm going to stop the recording for the folks at home because this is the last of what we're going to do. Thank you all for watching at home. I bet there are a lot of other good videos right next door to this one of good folks talking about useful stuff. And we'll wish you luck in all your semesters at the Academic Support Center.